YouTube fam? It's your boy, Jeff Rosado, and I'm finally back with another Sorcery Deck Tech video. I've seen a few requests on the Facebook community group that a few people want to see a Faerie deck list, so I thought I'd share my deck list with you guys today. Let's get into it. Okay, so I know that there is not a Faerie avatar for Sorcery just yet, but I've decided to play Sorcerer for my avatar of choice. This is a slow base control deck that wants to try to use fairies to dish out as much damage as possible, so having an avatar like Sorcerer just really helps with that strategy for the fact that he draws me more spells. For my artifacts, I am playing Philosopher Stone, Aquamarine Core, Amethyst Core, Ring of Morrigan, and 4 Waters of Paradise. Now I will say that this is a 53 card spellbook. If you decide to play this deck list, you can certainly just cut these 3 artifacts out because they don't really help with the main strategy of the deck. Sure, they support it, but I want to say Ring of Morrigan and 4 Waters of Paradise are certainly a must-have for any strategy. Before I continue, I want everyone to understand that I'm not trying to get everyone to play this deck list if you're trying to play fairies. Obviously, play the cards that you want to play the cards that you enjoy, because that's what's going to make you a better player at the end of the day, is by playing cards that you're familiar with. So anyways, I have these artifacts just for my mana ramp. Ring of Morrigan is an excellent card for the fact that it can dish out damage and give you life anytime you cast a spell. This allows you to prolong the game. This allows you to dish out damage to weaker minions, clearing them out of the way. This also allows you to deal damage to your opponent as a way to end the game as well. So Ring of Morrigan just has so much flexibility with it just by casting spells. And of course with Sorcerer drawing more spells, it just only fuels the Ring's ability. 4 Waters of Paradise is just excellent. If you sacrifice it, your next elemental spell requires no threshold and costs 4 less to cast. So it's a pretty good artifact. Essentially, it just allows me to ramp into my higher cost spells more efficiently. So for my auras, I have a Midsummer Night's Dream, 2 Sylvan Splender, 1 Atlantean Fate. So a Midsummer Night's Dream is excellent if you're going against mortals. Because at the affected sites, all mortals are disabled, and then they give your fairies +1 power. Sure, it's disabled if you have no fairies there, but just make sure that you have fairies there if you're trying to play this. And again, it's really good against mortals because it not only disables them, but let's say there's 4 mortals at a site. Essentially, all 4 of them will be disabled, but then you also give all your fairies +4 power because there are 4 mortals there. A phenomenal card for when you're trying to accelerate your game plan and close the game out really quick. So Sylvan Splender, I think, was a mistake. I don't think that this card should have ever been printed. It says whenever you cast a beast or fairy to an affected site, you draw a spell. However, it's disabled if any of your affected sites are successfully attacked. So you can literally play this with just 1 site being affected, meaning that your opponent will only have 1 opportunity to attack that site to disable this. But if you have minions to defend that site, more than likely your opponent's not really going to get a chance to disable this card, making it a phenomenal accelerant for this deck. So I play the 1 Atlantean Fate mainly because I want to disrupt my opponent's mana base, and I also want to have an answer for minions and artifacts if need be. It's a phenomenal aura that I feel like it's an auto-include in any deck that plays water. So for my minions, I play 3 Sling Pixies. Unfortunately, this is the only 1 mana cost fairy that is accessible currently in the game, and making it an exceptional makes it a little tougher to draw, but nevertheless, it's really only in here for the fact that it has the ranged ability. Sure, of course, it's a fairy, but the ranged ability is really the most important ability to note here. It does have Airborne, and it takes no damage from units with 4 or more power, so it certainly has a few advantages. I'm playing 4 Hyter Sprites. Hyter Sprites is great. Essentially, with its Genesis ability, you name a spell, and then spells with that name can't be cast until your next turn. So this can potentially stall your opponent out, which is really great because there could be a chance your opponent only has 1 card in their hand, and you have so many cards in this deck that allow you to actually see what your opponent's playing. If you time this right, you could actually just have your opponent skip their turn. It rarely happens, but it is possible. And mainly just for the fact that it stalls your opponent is great because these fairies have the opportunity to dish out as much damage as possible. So I'm playing 3 Tooth Faeries as well as 3 Sugarplum Pixies. These cards are essentially the same, just a little bit backwards. So for 2 mana, 2 power, they both have Airborne. Tooth Fairy says at the start of your turn you tap a nearby enemy, and then Sugarplum Pixies says at the end of your turn you untap another nearby ally. So essentially with Sugarplum Pixies you can attack, end your turn, and then for each Sugarplum Pixies they'll untap a nearby ally, making it so that your fairies can defend on your opponent's turn. Tooth Fairies is really great because it also just allows you to attack on your turn. Because if you tap your opponent's enemies down, they can't really defend when you're trying to declare attacks. So these 6 fairies are really great. They just really allow manipulation on the board so that way you can dish out as much damage as you possibly can. I'm playing 3 Fey Changeling. I'm so glad that this is a fairy, and it actually works really well with Hyter Sprites. So for example, you can summon this to any site, even your opponent's. It has a Genesis ability where you may return a minion there to its owner's hand. So if you play Fey Changeling, return your opponent's minion back to their hand, and then play Hyter Sprites, you can call that same minion and then they won't be able to cast it. There is something a little bit more sinister with this effect. So for example, if your opponent plays a minion, they can't attack with it normally if they don't have charge because it has Summoning Sickness. So they summon it. On your turn, you play Fey Changeling, return it back to their hand, and then if you follow up with a Hyter Sprites to prevent your opponent from casting it, you're not only stalling them, but now the next time that they do play this minion, it still can't attack, further stalling your opponent and also being a great way to remove a problematic minion off the board. I'm playing 2 Ribble Boggart. This is personally my tech for the deck, and I'm really glad that this is a fairy as well. The fact that it has 3 power really helps because it helps accelerate the fact that I'm trying to deal as much damage to my opponent as possible. I am not playing Kythera Mechanism, which is kind of a little bit weird for this deck because I feel like Kythera Mechanism could work with it, but I just decided not to play it. The reason why it's relevant is because Ribble Boggart says at the start of your turn, Ribble Boggart gains a random mutation. So what that means is that you choose between Airborne, Ranged, Lethal, or 3 power randomly, and then whichever outcome that becomes, Ribble Boggart will gain that mutation. It's very interesting because each ability has its own flexibilities in certain situations. Of course, Airborne is great because you can attack with it, use Sugarplum Pixies to untap it, and now your opponent really can't attack this. The ranged ability is really great because, of course, you can shoot a projectile and, essentially perform a ranged strike. And then, of course, lethal, this allows you to kill any minion that it attacks. And then with plus 3 power, it also just helps with our game plan, allowing it to deal 6 damage and closing the game out as quickly as it can. So it's a very interesting card. Of course, I can't control the random mutation in this deck, but I think that's what makes this card fun, because you just take what you can get and take as much advantage as you can with it. So I'm playing 2 Selfsame Simulacrum, my favorite fairy in the entire game. This can be summoned as a basic copy of any nearby minion. So you can copy your opponent's really strong minions, you can copy your fairies, etc. There was actually a time where I summoned this, didn't copy a single minion in play, and that was because I needed to cast a Midsummer Night's Dream while having a fairy present at its location. See, because if you can choose to just summon this as no copy, but it will still become a fairy. And of course, since my opponent had 3 mortals there, this actually got plus 3 power. So this was just a 3 power fairy minion that was just there, and it was very relevant for that situation. It may come up rarely, but it is a technique that you can use nevertheless if you decide to play it. But regardless, it's phenomenal just for the fact that it copies minions. I'm playing the 1 Faerie Queene. I mean, you have to play a Faerie Queene in the fairy deck, right? She is phenomenal for the fact that she has Airborne and Spellcaster, but she also makes all your nearby allied fairies take no damage from units with 4 or more power. And she just really helps with just the flexibility of casting your spells. Now, I play one Ruler of Thul. This is interesting because this is the only mortal I play in the deck. Just in case if I'm not playing against mortals, this is a way how I can activate a Midsummer Night's Dream to really just help give my other minions a +1 bonus. And that's a rare case nevertheless, but really why I play Ruler of Thul is just for the sheer fact that it has charge, and it helps with the main strategy of dishing out as much damage as possible. See, if I happen to have, let's say, Hyter Sprites, Sugarplum Pixies, and Sorcerer while I'm using Ruler of Thul, and if I manage to use all of these to attack my opponent, that's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 damage with just 4 cards. Now, someone was recommending that I play Nelly Longarms, and I decided not to play it because of several reasons. For starters, since I play a bunch of air sites, there are times where I have to move Nelly Longarms in position just to activate her ability. And when I try to do that, my opponent will move their minions out of the way, preventing me from even submerging their minions. And on top of that, Nelly doesn't really help with the aggressive part of this strategy. It really just helps with just killing a minion. But the thing is that this deck can already kill any minion, and I'll explain that as I further go on. But I believe Ruler of Thul is certainly the better choice because it's just too good. The fact that I can dish out so much damage with a few cards is just ridiculous, and I feel as though it's a perfect addition to this deck. For my final fairies, I'm playing 2 Seelie Court and 2 Unseelie Court. So Seelie Court and Unseelie Court are similar. See, because their abilities activate at the start of your turn. Seelie Court will allow both players to draw a spell for each fairy in the realm. And Unseelie Court will allow both players to discard a spell for each fairy in the realm. Now, what's interesting is that if you happen to have both of these in play at the same time, you can trigger the Seelie Court to draw spells first, and then use the Unseelie Court to have each player discard a spell. So the idea is to try to discard your opponent's hand as quickly as possible. So you really want to play Unseelie Court first before you play Seelie Court. See, because if your opponent has like 2 cards in their hand, you use Seelie Court to discard their hand. Now they have nothing, right? At that point in time, since it's at the start of your turn, you will also draw a spell for your initial draw phase, and then you can use Sorcerer to draw an additional card. So that'll give you 2 cards in advance. If you happen to play the Seelie Court and follow up with it, your opponent takes their turn, so forth. Now you can use Seelie Court, have each player draw their cards, and then Unseelie Court will have them discard those same amount of cards. You can essentially mill your opponent with these two, and this is actually why I accidentally almost milled myself out, because these cards work for both players, and unfortunately I am drawing a bit more cards than my opponent. I say unfortunately only because I can deck myself out. But that is why Sorcerer is the favorite avatar here, because when I do have these initiated, I'm able to actually get ahead in card advantage to disrupt my opponent as much as possible. Also, another thing, these are minions, not auras. A few people have mistaken this for auras, and these each have 5 power. So just keep in mind, these can attack and dish out a ton of damage to your opponent out of nowhere. Going into my magics, I have 1 Feast for Crows. Of course, I have cards that provide information on my opponent's deck. Unseelie Court is one of those cards, because if my opponent discards cards, I can actually gain information by checking their cemetery. And by using Feast for Crows, I can actually identify which cards to call with it. Feast for Crows says you name a spell, search your opponent's hand, spellbook, and cemetery for all cards with that name, and then you banish them. So this is really only in here for the fact that it has an answer for any card that is problematic against this deck. Now, another sinister part about this card is that a lot of people like to net deck, or rather they like to copy deck lists that are online. Because we have a website at curiosa.io, a bunch of people create decks every day, and there's bound to be a deck list that you're going to favor or have something that's similar to it. But the real factor is that if you're going up against a card like, let's say, Enchantress, there's certain cards that have to be in that deck in order for the deck to work, and there's cards that are just so familiar that you can identify what cards your opponent's playing just by looking at their avatar. Now, that won't happen every time, but just for the fact that that is a common thing that happens in Sorcery, this is what makes Feast for Crows very deadly. I play one Browse. I feel like you have to play Browse. I honestly think that this is the best card advantage in the entire game. You look at your next 7 spells, you put one of them into your hand, and then put the rest in your spellbook in the bottom in any order. So there was actually a time I used this, and when I was close to decking out, I started drawing the cards that I recognize with Browse, and that's how you know you're in a very dangerous spot. So you need to be very careful, but it could be a strategic plan, positioning where your cards are going to be, so that way you can further draw into them when you need them. But nevertheless, for 1 mana, selecting the best card out of your next 7 spells is just so good. So getting to my point of how I said that I can basically kill any minion in the game, I have 3 Shrink and 2 Polymorph. Shrink allows a nearby unit to set their base power to 0 until the next turn, and Polymorph essentially banishes a minion and then transforms it into a frog token, and the frog token has 0 power. So with these cards, we can essentially have any minion go to 0 power, and then we can use something like Sling Pixies to use a range strike to kill it, or even just use a Fey Changeling to attack it and kill it. It doesn't matter if your opponent has an Infernal Legion, if they have a Great Old One. These cards can essentially set them to 0 and then have any of your minions kill them. It's really good. Of course, they have to be nearby, but just the fact that these allow your fairies to kill any minion is just so good. I played 3 Cast into Exile. This is just a way how to get rid of other problematic minions that happen to be on your sites. Now, I will say that this is probably a card that may come out of the deck in the future, but for right now, I really like it. See, because there's some strategies that don't even play minions. So this card could potentially be a dead draw as well, but that is okay. Anytime you have a dead draw in this deck, if you're going up against a certain matchup, Unseelie Court will allow you to just discard it, so that way you can keep whatever relevant cards you need. But yeah, Cast to Exile, it shuffles any minion occupying an allied site back into the spellbook. It doesn't matter what minion it is, it'll go back into the spellbook, and you can just remove it from the field. You could also potentially use this with Feast for Crows as well, because you can shuffle the card back into their spellbook, and then now you know that it's in their deck, so you can use Feast for Crows to banish it, so that way they don't draw it later. The rest of the deck is pretty self-explanatory. I'm playing 4 Lightning Bolt, 2 Magic Missiles, and 2 Arcane Barrage. So these spells are really just in here just to dish out as much damage as possible. Lightning Bolt is great for even destroying minions with stealth, because of course it targets the location, not the actual unit itself. And it's a great way to finish off the game, get rid of any early game minions. Lightning Bolt literally is the GOAT. I love it. Magic Missiles, for 2 mana, you shoot 3 projectiles, and each one deals 1 damage. So essentially it's just firebolts, but for air. And Arcane Barrage is similar to Magic Missiles, but the thing is that you can pay more for X and shoot more projectiles. So later on in the game, even if you happen to have like a 4 Waters of Paradise and a bunch of mana, even with any of these artifacts as well, this will start to become a very deadly threat to your opponent, because your opponent will just have to respect the fact that you can just activate this out of nowhere and dish out a ton of damage. And it's really great for the fact that we have the Faerie Queene as well, having Spellcaster, because it allows us to have a bit more flexibility on the board. So that's it for my main spellbook, and now on to my Atlas. Okay, so decided to speed things up a little bit here, because the Atlas really is self-explanatory. Of course, I'm playing the color out of space. Because I'm playing multiple elements, this is just the best dual site, and for obvious reasons, of course. Playing Boneyard because I have a lot of powerful minions that I want to resurrect. I'm also playing Brocéliande. With the Genesis ability, I untap all nearby fairies, I tap nearby mortals, and then I give nearby beasts stealth. So obviously the most important factor is that I untap nearby fairies, and I tap nearby mortals. Mirror Realm, obviously, like, it's practically a staple in any deck. It just comes in play as a copy of any nearby site to just gain as much advantage with them as possible. Playing Sinkhole, of course, it's another staple. It literally is too good. Playing 3 Lighthouse just because it's a dual site for my 2 elements. I have 3 Face City, so like this card is actually really good, and it's another reason why I decided to play Shrink and Polymorph. you see, because I tap an allied fairy here to shoot a projectile and it deals 1 damage. So if I set a minion's base power to 0 and then I use the Fey City, I essentially can just use any fairy to tap, shoot a projectile, and deal 1 damage. It's also really good too because this is actually a way how I can finish the game if my opponent's on death's door as well, because any fairy that I draw is lethal as long as I'm able to tap it. And just note that, of course, you can't tap it if it has Summoning Sickness, but nevertheless, it's still a phenomenal card. And the fact that it provides Air Threshold too is just phenomenal. Babbling Brook and Bog, these are actually really, really good in the deck for the fact that it stalls my opponent further. So Babbling Brook says, Genesis, until your next turn, minions are disabled while on top of nearby sites. Bog is essentially the same thing, only except instead of disabling, it makes units immobile, which is great. Another thing to note too is that this works on minions, this works on units. So if your opponent's avatar is nearby, you can just make that immobile as well. It rarely happens, but it's there in case you need it. And of course, the fact that these provide elemental thresholds as well is just phenomenal. I'm playing 4 Winter River. Of course, this is just in here so I can look at my next spell and then put it at the bottom of my spellbook or keep it on top if I need to. I'm playing 1 Gothic Tower, 1 Lone Tower, 1 Dark Tower. Just allows me to accelerate my mana as long as I have 1 copy of them in play. But now the most important site in the deck, I have 4 Lookout. So this is really what makes the deck right here, because the fact that it comes in play with Genesis, I look at each opponent's hand, and this also provides Air Threshold is just so good. Of course, with Hyter Sprites, I'm able to look at my opponent's hand, play Hyter Sprites, and then declare what card I don't want them to cast. It's also really good with Feast for Crows, because if I play this, I'm able to call a relevant card and banish it from their hand. This is also insanely good too, because if my opponent happens to have cards that cost high in mana, if I happen to have Unseelie Court, I'm able to make sure that I can get those cards out of my opponent's hand, so long as I can force them to play more cards. And of course, just for the most obvious reason to play this gives me information on my opponent's deck. If I'm able to gain information on my opponent's deck, I'm going to have a better chance at controlling the game. So there you have it, guys. That is my Faerie Deck Tech for Sorcery. I hope that you've all enjoyed. If you're seeking further content, I invite you to check out the Collector Art House website, where I've uploaded a new article discussing Sorcery's best current cards. It would mean a lot to me if you would check it out and show your support to the Collector Art House website. I hope that you've all enjoyed. Stay tuned for more content, and as always, have an awesome week.